What would you do if your own family threw you out like trash, only to discover the next day that the worthless person they humiliated just became a billionaire overnight? This is a story of David Martinez, who was humiliated by his supposed lovable family. He was bullied with rejection and disdain, and he fought through the poverty by winning one lottery ticket of $7.8 billion. And it changed his life, and the people who mocked poverty in his life learned the true price of cruelty. Hit that subscribe button before we begin, because this tale of ultimate revenge will leave you speechless. Now let's dive in. David Martinez had learned to make himself invisible long before his family made it clear they wished he actually was. At 28, he worked double shifts at the warehouse during the week and cleaned office buildings on weekends, barely making rent on his studio apartment in the worst part of town. The apartment was a testament to a life lived on the margins. Thin walls, a radiator that clanged like a dying machine, and a single window that looked out onto a brick wall so close he could touch it. David had furnished it with items from curbsides and thrift stores, a sagging couch covered with a blanket, a card table that served as both desk and dining room, and a mattress on the floor. But David never complained. Complaining required having someone to listen. The Martinez family had once been working class, but over the past decade, several of David's cousins had struck it rich. Carlos had built a successful construction company and drove a Tesla. Maria had married a doctor and spent her days posting Instagram photos from expensive restaurants. Even his youngest cousin, Roberto, had parlayed social media into six figures selling supplements. And then there was David, still wearing the same jacket from high school, still walking everywhere because he couldn't afford car insurance, still counting quarters for groceries. On this particular Friday in November, David stood in front of his bathroom mirror and tried to make himself presentable for Carlos's birthday party. The invitation had surprised him. He hadn't been invited to a family gathering in over a year. His party outfit was heartbreaking. Black slacks from Goodwill, his father's old white shirt taken in at the seams, and the same dress shoes he'd worn to his parents' funeral. Resold twice, but still holding together through stubbornness. He'd saved for 2 weeks to buy Carlos a decent gift, a bottle of aged whiskey wrapped in carefully reused paper. David took the bus across town, watching neighborhoods gradually improve until he reached Carlos's house in the hills, all glass and steel, with a circular driveway full of BMWs and Mercedes. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see his family laughing and embracing, all dressed in clothes that probably cost more than David made in a month. Carlos opened the door in a silk shirt that cost more than David's rent. His smile was genuine, and for a moment, David felt hope. "David, you made it. Come in, everyone's here." The great room was larger than David's entire apartment, with exposed beams and a fireplace big enough to stand in. His extended family filled the space, cousins, aunts, uncles, all dressed like magazine models. The reaction to David's entrance was telling. Conversations shifted, became careful. Smiles appeared, but didn't reach eyes. David recognized the look, sympathetic but uncomfortable, like encountering a homeless person. "David," Aunt Rosa embraced him carefully, not disturbing her perfect hair. "You look well." It was a lie, and they both knew it. One by one, family members greeted him with the same careful distance. His cousin Maria air-kissed his cheeks while avoiding actual contact. Roberto clapped his shoulder with aggressive friendliness. "David, my man, how's the warehouse treating you?" "It's steady work," David replied, the most positive thing he could say. Roberto nodded enthusiastically. "Steady is good. We should all appreciate simple things, right? Even if it's not, glamorous." The condescension was thick enough to cut. As evening progressed, David found himself simultaneously included and excluded. Present physically, but clearly not one of them. Conversations revolved around private schools, European vacations, stock portfolios, topics foreign to David's experience. When Carlos mentioned needing contractors for renovations, David offered to help. The silence was deafening. "That's generous," Carlos said carefully. "But we need someone with professional credentials, insurance, and all that." Translation: someone who wouldn't embarrass them in front of neighbors. The moment that would define everything came during dinner in Carlos's formal dining room. David was seated at the far end, next to an empty chair, positioned where his worn clothes would be least noticeable. The meal was extraordinary, catered and paired with expensive wines. David ate carefully, aware his table manners might not measure up to his sophisticated relative standards. Conversations flowed around him like water around a stone: stock markets, real estate, vacation homes, private schools. David contributed where he could, but felt increasingly like an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. The whispers started small. Maria leaning over to her husband, glancing at David sympathetically. Roberto's wife commenting to Aunt Rosa, both looking at David with mixed pity and discomfort. The whispers grew louder as wine flowed and inhibitions lowered. "I mean, it's admirable he keeps trying," Maria said, her voice carrying. "But at some point you have to face reality. Some people don't have the drive to improve their circumstances," Dr. Peterson added with physician's authority. "Maybe we should help him get back on his feet," Aunt Rosa suggested, her tone like proposing charity work. "We've tried," Carlos replied. "Remember the job I offered?" He said the hours wouldn't work. What Carlos didn't mention was that the job paid less than David's warehouse work and had no benefits. "Sometimes you can't help people who won't help themselves," Roberto chimed in with borrowed wisdom. David set down his fork, appetite gone. These people he'd grown up with saw him as a cautionary tale, evidence of what happened when you didn't want success badly enough. Then Uncle Miguel, drunk and belligerent, delivered the killing blow. You know David's problem? No ambition. No fire in his belly. Content to be mediocre. He slammed his wine glass down. Look at him, 30 years old, living in some rat hole, working teenage jobs. He sits there acting like he belongs at this table with people who've accomplished something. "Dad, that's enough," Carlos started. "No, we invite him out of pity, but what's the point? He brings down the whole mood. He can't even afford decent clothes." The cruelty was breathtaking, but worse was the murmur of agreement rippling around the table. Miguel's voice dropped to a whisper that carried more force than shouting. "I think it would be better for everyone if David found somewhere else to be tonight." Every eye focused on David, waiting to see how he'd respond to ultimate rejection. David could have fought back, pointed out Miguel's hypocrisies, explained about advantages he'd been denied. But what was the point? They decided who he was. Instead, David absorbed the blow and maintained dignity. "You're right," he said quietly. "I should go." He collected his jacket with careful movements and walked toward the door. Behind him, conversations resumed as if he'd never existed. At the front door, David turned back one final time. His family had returned to celebrating Carlos's success. "Happy birthday, Carlos," he called out. Carlos looked up, flushed with wine and embarrassment. "Thanks, David, and thank you for the gift." David nodded once and walked into the night, closing the door on warmth and light that would never again be meant for him. The November air cut through David's thin jacket, but he barely noticed. The bus wouldn't come for 45 minutes, and he couldn't bear standing at the stop, visible to anyone from Carlos's party. So he began walking. For an hour, David walked through tree-lined streets, past houses glowing with warm light, and families who valued each other. He realized he was crying, not dramatic sobs, but quiet, steady tears of someone acknowledging painful truth. His family didn't love him. They tolerated him, pitied him, but didn't love him. Not really. Not enough. Love wasn't supposed to come with income conditions. Love wasn't supposed to make you earn your place at the table every time. Love wasn't supposed to hurt like this. By the time David reached his neighborhood, broken streetlights, leaning buildings, graffiti-covered facades, his feet were blistered and jackets soaked through. The contrast was stark, but this was home. Here, his worn clothes didn't make him stand out. Poverty wasn't a character flaw, but a shared condition navigated with whatever dignity people could maintain. In his studio apartment, David sat on his sagging couch staring at the wrapped whiskey intended for Carlos. $30 that might as well have been $300, spent on someone who'd watched him be humiliated and ejected. David unwrapped the bottle with careful hands, smoothing paper for reuse. He poured a small glass, couldn't afford to be much of a drinker, and contemplated his complete solitude. The people who shared his blood considered him an obligation, a source of discomfort, someone tolerated out of duty rather than embraced out of love. For the first time in years, David made himself a promise. He would never again apologize for who he was or beg for acceptance from people who decided he wasn't worth their respect. He would build a life belonging to him alone. As he prepared for bed, David felt something shift, not hope exactly, but grim determination. He'd been rejected completely, cruelly. Perhaps that was exactly what he needed to stop looking backward and start building something for himself. The next evening after work, exhausted and still stinging from family rejection, David found himself at a late-night cafe called the Night Owl. He'd walked past it hundreds of times but never entered. Coffee shops seemed like luxuries he couldn't afford. Tonight, the warm light spilling from windows and promise of human warmth made him reconsider. David checked his wallet. $11.63 until his next paycheck. Enough for coffee and maybe a donut if he was careful. The interior was exactly what he'd expected. Mismatched furniture, local art, deliberately eclectic decor. Only 3 other customers occupied the space at this late hour. Just a regular coffee large, David told the purple-haired barista. $2.50, she replied. As David waited for coffee, his eyes wandered to a display case near the register containing impulse purchases. Candy bars, energy drinks, and lottery tickets. Powerballs up to 700 million, the barista noted, following his gaze. Biggest jackpot in history. $700 million. A number so large as to be almost meaningless, more than David would make in several lifetimes, more than his entire extended family was worth combined. How much for a ticket? David asked, though he knew he couldn't afford it. $2? David looked at the 50 cents in his palm. With $2, he could buy a lottery ticket. With 50 cents, he could tip the barista or save toward tomorrow's lunch. The rational part of his mind reminded him lottery tickets were taxes on people bad at math. The odds were astronomical, but the rational part, systematically crushed by years of rejection, whispered differently. What if this was the universe balancing scales? What if all the humiliation was preparation for transformation? You know what? David said impulsively. Give me a Powerball ticket too. The barista raised eyebrows but shrugged, reaching for the machine. Quick pick or choose your own numbers? David almost asked for quick pick, but something made him pause. If he was going to waste $2 on mathematical impossibility, he'd make it personal. He chose meaningful dates. His birthday 11, his parents' anniversary 23, the day they died 15, his apartment number 7. The age when he'd first understood his family's poverty 9. For the Powerball, he chose 22, the age when his parents died and he'd become truly alone. The machine printed his selections with tomorrow night's drawing date. David folded the ticket carefully, putting it in his wallet next to his remaining $9.63. Good luck, the barista said with genuine friendliness. Thanks, David replied. I'll need it. David took his coffee to a window table and examined the ticket. 6 numbers representing his life's most important dates, printed on paper that would be worthless in 24 hours when someone else's numbers were drawn. But for tonight, the ticket represented something David hadn't felt in years. Possibility. For the price of cheap lunch, he'd purchased the right to imagine a different life. One where money wasn't constant worry, where he could help instead of always needing help, where family opinion became irrelevant because he'd have resources to build life on his own terms. David knew the odds. He understood he was throwing away money he couldn't afford to waste. But sometimes hope was worth more than its mathematical probability. His bus arrived on schedule. As the city passed outside windows, David thought about the ticket and the impossibly remote chance that tomorrow might change everything. He fell asleep that night with the lottery ticket on his nightstand. 6 numbers connecting his past to an imaginary future where everything would be different. He had no way of knowing that in 18 hours, those numbers would make him one of the wealthiest people in the world. David's alarm went off at 5:15 a.m. as always, but something felt different. He'd slept better than in months. Maybe the strange catharsis of complete family rejection had been liberating. Through his morning routine, the lottery ticket sat on his nightstand looking exactly like what it was. Paper with numbers that would be thrown away tomorrow when the drawing revealed he hadn't won. At work, David found his mind wandering unusually. Physical labor normally provided meditation, his body finding rhythm while his mind went blank. Today, he kept thinking about numbers, probability, the drawing that evening. $700 million. The number was incomprehensibly large. But what would he actually do with such wealth? Pay off debts, obviously, though those were small enough that $700 million would make them invisible. Buy a house not huge and ostentatious like Carlos's, but solid and his own, with a yard and room for books he'd always wanted but couldn't afford. Help people, definitely. David had received charity enough to know how crucial it could be, how small amounts given at the right time could mean the difference between making rent and eviction. And his family, what would he do about his family? Would Carlos suddenly want time with him if David could afford to reciprocate expensive lifestyle? Would Maria include him in photos if he wore designer clothes? Would Roberto seek advice if David became richer than all of them combined? The answers felt obvious and depressing. Of course, they'd treat him differently if he was wealthy. But that wouldn't represent genuine love. It would be the same superficial judgment pointed in the opposite direction. David's shift ended at 3 p.m. Instead of going home, restless energy kept him walking through neighborhoods where people like him lived in apartments like his, working jobs paying just enough to survive but never thrive. These were David's people in ways his blood relatives weren't. They understood poverty's mathematics, the exhausting mental energy required to stretch every dollar. If David won the lottery, when he didn't win, he corrected himself. He would miss this understanding, this shared experience of making something from nothing. Extreme wealth would separate him from the community of struggle defining his adult life. But perhaps separation would be worth it for the freedom it provided. Freedom from constant money anxiety, from body-destroying jobs without security, from family members measuring worth by bank balance. That evening, David finished his cleaning route and walked to the bus stop. The lottery drawing would occur in an hour and a half, but David didn't rush to check results. Part of him wanted to preserve possibility as long as possible, to maintain the small space of hope that had sustained him all day. Once he confirmed his numbers hadn't been drawn, which was virtually certain, that hope would die, and he'd return to the same life he'd been living for years. Back in his apartment, David made instant coffee and sat with his ancient laptop. The lottery website loaded slowly, probably due to heavy traffic from people checking if they'd won the largest jackpot in history. Finally, the website loaded completely, displaying winning numbers in large, bold font. Powerball drawing November 15th winning numbers: 7 to 9, 11 to 15, 23 Powerball, 22 jackpot, $742 million. David stared at the screen for several seconds before numbers registered. His apartment, 7, the age when he'd learned about family poverty; 9, his birthday; 11, the day his parents died; 15, their anniversary; 23, the age when he'd become truly alone; 22. Every single number was exactly what he'd chosen. David's hands shook so badly he nearly spilled coffee over his laptop. He set the cup down carefully and looked again, certain he'd misread something. That tired eyes and wishful thinking had rearranged numbers into what he wanted to see. But no, the screen numbers matched exactly the numbers he'd chosen. Dates defining his life transformed into a combination making him one of the wealthiest people in the world. David pulled his wallet out with trembling hands and extracted the lottery ticket. Numbers printed on the small slip were identical to his computer screen. 7 to 9, 11 to 15, 23, Powerball, 22. David stared at the ticket, then the screen, then back at the ticket. The reality was too large for his mind to process. He was rich, not comfortable or well off. Wealthy beyond anything he'd ever imagined possible. $742 million. Even after taxes and deductions, David would still have more money than he could spend in several lifetimes. The magnitude felt surreal, like something happening to someone else in a world where impossible things were possible. David refreshed the website, half expecting numbers to change, the whole thing to reveal itself as an elaborate mistake. But numbers remained the same, with new information added. One winning ticket sold in New York. One ticket, his ticket. David was the sole winner of the largest lottery jackpot in American history. This morning, he'd been David Martinez, warehouse worker and janitor, the family embarrassment who couldn't afford decent clothes. Tonight, he was David Martinez, multimillionaire, richer than everyone who'd ever looked down on him combined. The irony was perfect. Less than 48 hours after being told he had no ambition, no drive, no success potential, David had achieved financial success, making his critics' accomplishments look modest. Carlos's construction company, built over 15 years, was probably worth a few million. David had just won more than 200 times that amount. Maria's doctor husband probably earned a few $100,000 yearly. David now had enough to pay that salary to 1,000 doctors for years. Even Roberto, with his social media success, had probably accumulated low millions in net worth. David could now buy and sell him several hundred times over. But more than the money's sheer quantity was what it represented: freedom. Freedom from financial anxiety, from exhausting jobs without security, from family members measuring his worth by bank balance. Most importantly, David now had freedom to choose. He could choose whether to forgive relatives who'd rejected him or let them experience being on the outside looking in. He could choose to be generous or vindictive, forgiving or ruthless, merciful or just. For the first time in his adult life, David Martinez held all the power in relationships with people who had shaped him, hurt him, and taught him exactly what their love was worth. The question now was what he would choose to do with that power. David didn't sleep that night. His mind raced through implications of what had happened. Every few minutes, he'd pull the lottery ticket from his wallet and compare it to winning numbers on his computer screen, as if reality might change if he wasn't constantly verifying it. By 6 a.m., David had called in sick to both jobs, using vacation days he'd hoarded for years. He told supervisors he had a family emergency. Not entirely untrue. David was about to become a family emergency for every relative who'd treated him like an inconvenience. First order was practical, claiming winnings and transforming paper into actual wealth. The New York lottery office opened at 9 a.m., and David was waiting outside when doors unlocked. The process took 2 hours: signing paperwork, providing identification, choosing between lump sum and annual payments, listening to officials explain extreme wealth procedures. He chose the lump sum, roughly $450 million after taxes. By noon, David Martinez was officially one of New York's richest people. His bank account, containing $11.63 that morning, now showed a balance his ATM receipt couldn't display. Too many digits for the machine's programming. David's first purchase as a multi-millionaire was lunch at a decent restaurant. Nothing fancy, just somewhere he could sit, eat food he didn't prepare, and process what had happened. As he ate, David's phone began ringing. Reporters who'd somehow gotten his contact information. But then he saw a familiar number: Carlos. David stared at his phone for several rings before answering. Carlos had no way of knowing about the lottery win yet. David? Carlos's voice sounded strained, uncertain. I was calling to apologize for the other night. What my father said was unacceptable, and I should have stopped him. David listened with detached interest. Carlos sounded genuinely remorseful, but David wondered if the apology would come if Carlos knew the family embarrassment had just become the family lottery winner. I appreciate that, David said carefully. Look, I know this is probably too little, too late. But would you like to get together for lunch this week? Just us. I feel like we need to talk. David almost laughed. Yesterday, Carlos had stood by while his father humiliated David. Today, Carlos wanted lunch to rebuild their relationship. But David was curious about something. He wanted to know if his family's sudden reconciliation interest was motivated by genuine remorse or something else. Actually, David said, I'm free this afternoon. Want to meet somewhere? Carlos sounded surprised, but pleased. That would be great. How about Marcelo's on 5th Street? I'll make a reservation. Marcelo's was a kind of restaurant David had never afforded. Entrees starting at $50. Wine list with bottles costing more than his monthly rent. Yesterday, suggesting lunch, there would have been Carlos showing off superior financial position. Today, it was just a restaurant. Sounds perfect, David said. How about 2 p.m.? David decided not to change clothes. He wanted to arrive wearing the same outfit deemed unacceptable for Carlos's birthday party. He wanted to see his cousin's reaction when the family embarrassment walked into an expensive restaurant and ordered whatever he wanted. Marcelo's was exactly what David expected. White tablecloths, crystal glasses, servers with practiced efficiency. The maitre d' looked David up and down, clearly wondering if someone dressed so modestly could afford to eat there. "I'm meeting Carlos Martinez," David said. "He should have a reservation." The maitre d's expression softened. Carlos was apparently a known customer, and David was escorted to a window table where his cousin waited. Carlos stood to embrace David, but his hug felt different. The careful embrace of someone trying to rebuild a damaged relationship, someone who needed something from the person they were hugging. "David, I'm so glad you could make it," Carlos said as they sat. "I've been thinking about the other night, and I feel terrible." David picked up his menu, scanning prices that would have been shocking 24 hours earlier. Today, they were just numbers. "Your father said what he thought," David replied. "I'm not sure there's anything to apologize for." A server appeared, recognizing Carlos as a regular. "Good afternoon, Mr. Martinez." "The usual?" "Actually," David said before Carlos could respond, "I'll have the ribeye medium rare with a lobster tail. And let's start with a bottle of your best wine. Something in the $300 range." The server's eyebrows rose slightly. Carlos looked genuinely shocked. "David," Carlos said quietly, "that's going to be like $400 for lunch." David smiled. "I can afford it." Carlos stared at his cousin, trying to figure out what had changed. David wore the same clothes, had the same job, lived in the same apartment. But something fundamental had shifted, a confidence Carlos had never seen. "Did something happen?" Carlos asked carefully. David took a sip of water and considered how to answer. He could reveal his lottery win now. Watch Carlos's face transform from confused concern to desperate calculation. Or let the revelation unfold slowly, enjoying his cousin's growing bewilderment. "You could say that," David replied. "I've had some good news recently." The wine arrived, a Bordeaux costing more than David's previous monthly food budget. David tasted it with the same attention he'd give a $2 convenience store bottle. "It's perfect," he told the server. Carlos watched with growing amazement. His cousin, too embarrassed to eat much at the birthday party, now ordered expensive wine and premium steaks as if he did it daily. "David," Carlos said slowly, "what the hell's going on?" David leaned back and smiled. For years, he'd been the one asking questions, trying to figure out where he fit in his family's hierarchy, desperate to understand why he was treated differently. Now, for the first time in his adult life, David held information his family needed, power they would want access to. "I won the lottery," David said simply. Carlos blinked several times, as if the words hadn't registered. "You what?" "Last night, Powerball, $742 million. The silence was deafening. Carlos stared at David as if he were speaking a foreign language, clearly struggling to process information that didn't match anything he understood about his cousin's life. "You're joking," Carlos said finally. David pulled his phone out and showed Carlos his bank balance, a number so large it took Carlos several seconds to count the digits. "Jesus Christ," Carlos whispered. "David, this is incredible. This changes everything." David nodded. "Yes, it does." Their food arrived, and David ate his expensive meal with methodical approach. Carlos barely touched his plate, too shocked to think about food. "Have you told anyone else?" Carlos asked. "You're the first." Carlos's face lit up with relief or calculation or both. He was the first family member to know about David's transformation, putting him in position to benefit from that knowledge. "David, this is amazing. You're set for life. We need to celebrate, tell the family." "Do we?" David interrupted quietly. Carlos stopped talking, suddenly aware that something in David's tone had changed. 3 days ago," David continued, "your father told me I had no ambition, no drive, and no business sitting at the same table as successful people. He asked me to leave your house because I wasn't worthy to be in your family photos." Carlos's face flushed with embarrassment. "David, he was drunk, he didn't mean." "He meant every word," David said. "And you let him say it. You all let him say it." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Carlos clearly wanted to apologize again, somehow undo the damage, but David's expression suggested the time for apologies might have passed. "What do you want me to do?" Carlos asked finally. David smiled, and for the first time since they'd sat down, Carlos saw something genuinely frightening in his cousin's eyes. "I want you to call your father," David said. I want you to tell him that his failure of a nephew just became richer than everyone in the family combined. And then I want you to invite everyone to dinner at the most expensive restaurant in the city." Carlos nodded eagerly. "Of course, absolutely. When do you want to do this?" "Tonight," David said. "I've waited long enough to see what my family's love is really worth." As David paid the $400 lunch bill without blinking, Carlos made phone calls to every member of their extended family. David watched his cousin's face as he delivered the news, saw the mix of excitement and desperation that came from suddenly being on the right side of a family fortune. By evening, David would know exactly how much his relatives' opinions could change when the balance of power shifted completely in his favor. That evening, the entire Martinez family gathered at Le Bernardin, one of the city's most expensive restaurants. David arrived in a brand new tailored suit, the first expensive clothing he'd ever owned. The transformation was remarkable. He looked like someone who'd always been wealthy, someone who belonged in rooms like this. His family was already seated at a large table, their faces showing various combinations of excitement, nervousness, and calculation. Uncle Miguel, the man who'd called David worthless 2 days earlier, stood and extended his hand with a smile that was almost desperate. "David, my boy, Carlos told us the incredible news." David looked at Miguel's outstretched hand for a long moment before shaking it. "Uncle Miguel, good to see you." One by one, his relatives approached him with newfound warmth. Maria kissed his cheeks enthusiastically. Roberto clapped his back like they were best friends. Aunt Rosa embraced him with genuine affection, or at least a convincing imitation of it. As they sat down to dinner, a meal that would cost more than David used to make in a month, the conversation flowed differently than it had 3 nights earlier. Suddenly, everyone was interested in David's opinion. They asked about his plans, his investments, his future. They treated him like the most important person at the table, which of course he now was. David watched this performance with fascination. These were the same people who'd whispered about his failures, who'd agreed he didn't belong at their table, who'd allowed him to be humiliated and ejected from their gathering. Now, they hung on his every word. "David," Miguel said, raising his wine glass, "I want to propose a toast. To family, to success, and to second chances." Everyone raised their glasses and looked at David expectantly. He stood slowly, his own glass in hand, and looked around the table at these faces that had shaped his childhood and broken his heart. "To family," David said quietly, "and to learning what that word really means." They drank, but something in David's tone made several of them look uncomfortable. "You know," David continued, still standing, "3 days ago, I sat at a table much like this one. My family was there, celebrating success and prosperity. I was told I had no ambition, no drive, that I didn't belong with successful people. I was asked to leave because my presence was an embarrassment." The silence was deafening. Everyone stared at their plates except Miguel, who had the grace to look ashamed. "Tonight," David said, "those same people are here, celebrating me, embracing me, treating me like I'm the most important person in the room. The only thing that's changed is my bank balance." Carlos shifted uncomfortably. "David, we've all apologized for that night." "Have you?" David asked, because I don't remember hearing any apologies until after Carlos knew about the money. David reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "I've had an interesting day," he said. "After claiming my lottery winnings, I visited a lawyer. I had him draw up some documents." He placed the envelope on the table. "This contains checks made out to every person at this table. Enough money to pay off your mortgages, your debts, to set up your children's college funds. Life-changing amounts for each of you." Everyone leaned forward, eyes bright with hope and greed. "The checks are already signed," David continued. "All I have to do is distribute them." The excitement around the table was palpable. David could see them mentally spending the money, planning how this windfall would transform their lives. "But I've decided not to," David said simply. The words hit like a physical blow. Faces fell, shoulders sagged, the careful smiles disappeared. "You see," David explained, "I spent my entire adult life believing that family meant unconditional love. I thought blood was thicker than water, that no matter what happened, you stood by your relatives. You taught me that wasn't true." David picked up the envelope and put it back in his jacket. You showed me that your love was conditional on my success, that my worth as a person was measured by my bank account, that I was only welcome at your table if I could afford to belong there. Uncle Miguel found his voice. David, we made mistakes, but we're family. Are we? David interrupted. Because family doesn't humiliate each other. Family doesn't throw people out for being poor. The family doesn't whisper about each other's failures and agree they'd be better off somewhere else. David looked around the table one more time. I'm wealthy now. Wealthier than I ever dreamed possible. I can afford to be generous, to forgive, to help people who treated me badly when I needed help most. He stood up, straightening his expensive jacket. But you know what I learned 3 nights ago? I don't need your approval anymore. I don't need your acceptance. And I certainly don't need to prove my worth to people who only value me when I'm rich enough to be useful. David walked toward the restaurant exit, then paused and turned back. If you enjoyed this episode, kindly hit the subscribe button till we see you in the next episode. Thanks.